August 25th, 1944. The roads of northern France stretched like veins across a dying landscape. Dust clouds rose from the earth, thick and choking, turning the summer sky into a haze of brown and gold. Beneath that haze, a convoy rolled. Not 10 trucks, not 100, but thousands. Bumper to bumper, headlights blazing even in daylight, engines roaring like a mechanical heartbeat that refused to stop. They called it the Red Ball Express, a supply line so desperate, so improvised, so utterly vital that without it, the Allied advance across Europe would have ground to a halt. And the men driving those trucks, pushing through exhaustion, enemy fire, and roads that barely existed, were largely Black American soldiers. Men who had been told they weren't fit for combat. Men who had been relegated to the shadows of a segregated army. Men who, in the summer and fall of 1944, became the lifeline of victory. This is the story of how 6,000 trucks a day kept General George S. Patton's Third Army rolling toward Germany. How a supply operation born from chaos became a miracle, and how the men behind the wheel, driving 20 hours straight without sleep, without rest, without recognition, proved that heroism doesn't always wear a combat badge. Sometimes it wears grease-stained gloves and drives through the night because there's no other choice. This is the story of the Red Ball Express. The summer of 1944 was supposed to be different. After years of brutal fighting, after the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, after the hedgerows of France where every field was a death trap, the Allies finally broke through. On July 25th, Operation Cobra shattered German defenses near St. Lo. Within days, American forces were racing across France faster than anyone had imagined. General George S. Patton's Third Army led the charge. His tanks rolled east like a steel avalanche, liberating towns, capturing bridges, pushing the Germans back towards their own borders. By mid-August, Patton's forces had advanced over 400 miles in just 2 weeks. It was a stunning achievement. It was also a logistical nightmare, because while Patton's tanks could move fast, his supply lines could not. The Allied invasion had been planned around the assumption that they would capture French ports quickly: Cherbourg, Brest, Le Havre. These ports would serve as supply hubs, bringing in fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment from England. But the Germans had destroyed most of the port facilities before retreating. Cherbourg was a wreck. Brest wouldn't fall until September, and the only functioning port the Allies had was still back in Normandy, over 400 miles from the front. That meant everything. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every can of rations had to be trucked overland. And the roads were a disaster. Bombed-out bridges, cratered highways, narrow country lanes designed for horse carts, not military convoys. The existing supply system, designed to move 20 miles a day, was now expected to cover 400. By late August, Patton's tanks were running on fumes. Literally. Some units had less than a day's worth of fuel left. Ammunition was rationed. Food supplies dwindled. Soldiers joked bitterly that they were winning the war so fast they might starve before reaching Berlin. Something had to be done. And it had to be done immediately. On August 25, 1944, the U.S. Army launched one of the most ambitious supply operations in military history. They called it the Red Ball Express, named after the railroad term for high-priority freight. The concept was simple, almost brutally so. Take every available truck, every driver, every gallon of fuel, and run a continuous convoy from the Normandy beaches to the front lines. No stops, no delays, just drive. The route was designated with red balls painted on signs along the roads. No civilian traffic allowed. No other military vehicles unless authorized. The Red Ball Express had absolute priority. If you saw a red ball, you got out of the way. The operation was massive. At its peak, the Red Ball Express involved over 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day. They hauled 12,500 tons of supplies daily, sometimes more. The convoys stretched for miles, a river of steel and canvas flowing east towards the front. Drivers worked in shifts that lasted 20 hours or more. They drove through rain, through mud, through enemy air attacks. They drove until their hands cramped on the wheel, until their eyes blurred from exhaustion, until they couldn't remember the last time they slept. And the vast majority of them were black. In 1944, the United States military was segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, commanded mostly by white officers. They were assigned to support roles, labor battalions, quartermaster companies. The prevailing belief, rooted in racism and ignorance, was that black soldiers lacked the discipline, intelligence, and courage for combat. It was a lie, but it was a lie that shaped policy. So when the Red Ball Express was formed, the Army turned to the units it had available. Quartermaster truck companies, port battalions, service units, and the majority of these units were black. Out of the approximately 23,000 soldiers who served in the Red Ball Express over its 83 days of operation, roughly 75% were African American. These men came from all over: sharecroppers from Mississippi, factory workers from Detroit, teachers from Georgia, mechanics from Chicago. They had enlisted or been drafted into an army that didn't trust them, didn't respect them, and often didn't even acknowledge their contributions. But when the call came to drive, they answered. Because they understood something the Army didn't, that this was their chance, not just to prove themselves, though that mattered, but to do something that mattered, to be part of something bigger than the racism they faced every day, to drive those trucks, to keep the Army moving, to help win the war. And so they drove. The Red Ball Express route ran from the beaches of Normandy, through the towns of Alençon, Chartres, and Dreux, all the way to the front lines near the German border. It was roughly 400 miles one way, though the exact distance varied as the front moved. The roads were a patchwork of French highways, country lanes, and hastily repaired bridges. Driving the route was an ordeal. The trucks, mostly GMC 2.5-ton deuce-and-a-half models, were reliable but not comfortable. No power steering, no air conditioning, seats that felt like wooden planks after the first hour. The trucks were loaded to capacity, sometimes beyond. Fuel drums, ammunition crates, rations, medical supplies, everything stacked high, tied down with rope and prayer. The convoys moved in columns, sometimes 50 trucks long, sometimes more. Drivers were supposed to maintain a 60-yard gap between vehicles, but in practice they drove bumper to bumper, headlights on even in daylight, so the convoy could be seen from miles away. At night, the lights created a glowing river of yellow that snaked through the French countryside. The roads themselves were a hazard. Potholes the size of bathtubs, bridges that groaned under the weight of the trucks, narrow passages where two vehicles could barely pass, and everywhere the dust, thick, choking clouds that turned the air brown and coated everything, lungs, eyes, uniforms, in a fine grit that never went away. Then there were the accidents. Trucks overturned on sharp curves, brakes failed on steep hills, drivers, exhausted beyond reason, fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into ditches, trees, other trucks. Some convoys lost a dozen vehicles in a single day, The wrecks were pushed to the side of the road, stripped for parts, and left behind. There was no time to stop. And through it all, the drivers kept moving. Because the front needed fuel, because Patton's tanks couldn't wait. Because if they stopped, the war stopped. Private First Class James "Jimmy" Ruckert was 23 years old when he joined the Red Ball Express. He was from a small town in Alabama, the son of a sharecropper who had never owned the land he worked. Jimmy had learned to drive on his father's old Ford truck, the one they used to haul cotton to market. He could drive anything, he said. Tractors, trucks, even a mule cart if you gave him the reins. When he was drafted in 1943, he was assigned to a quartermaster truck company. He didn't complain. He figured driving was better than digging ditches. But when the Red Ball Express started, he realized it was something else entirely. "We drove 20 hours straight," he later recalled in an interview. "No breaks, no rest stops. You ate while you drove. You pissed in a can while you drove. If you were lucky, the guy next to you stayed awake long enough to slap you if you started nodding off. If you weren't lucky, you woke up in a ditch." Jimmy drove for 67 consecutive days. He hauled fuel, ammunition, rations. He drove through rain so heavy he couldn't see the truck in front of him. He drove through German air raids, ducking low in his seat while bullets pinged off the hood. He drove through exhaustion so deep he hallucinated, seeing phantom trucks on the road, hearing voices that weren't there. But he didn't stop. None of them did. Corporal William "Bill" McIntyre was another driver. He was from Detroit, a mechanic before the war. He knew engines the way some men knew scripture. When his truck broke down, which happened often, he fixed it on the side of the road. No tools? He improvised. No parts? He scavenged from wrecks. He once kept a truck running for 200 miles with a fuel line held together by chewing gum and wire. "People don't understand," he said years later. "We weren't just driving. We were keeping the war alive. Every gallon of fuel we delivered meant another mile Patton could advance. Every crate of ammo meant another German position we could take. We knew that, and we weren't going to let anyone down." Then there was Sergeant Charles "Charlie" Thomas. He was older, 34, a teacher from Georgia before the war. He had a wife and 2 daughters back home. He wrote them letters every chance he got, though he never mentioned how dangerous the driving was. He didn't want them to worry. Charlie was a convoy leader. He rode in the lead truck, navigating the route, making sure the convoy stayed together. He carried a map, a compass, and a notebook where he logged every mile, every delay, every problem. He was meticulous, precise. He believed that if you did things right, if you paid attention to the details, you could keep your men alive. He was right. In 83 days, Charlie's convoy lost only 3 trucks to accidents, none to enemy fire. His men called him the Professor because he never stopped teaching, never stopped reminding them to check their brakes, to watch the road, to stay alert. "We're not heroes," he told them once. "We're just doing our job, but we're going to do it better than anyone else." The Red Ball Express wasn't just about driving trucks. It was about solving 1,000 problems at once, with no manual, no training, and no time. First, there was the fuel problem. The trucks consumed fuel almost as fast as they delivered it. A fully loaded deuce and a half got about 5 miles per gallon. Over a 400-mile round trip, that meant each truck burned through 80 gallons of fuel. Multiply that by 6,000 trucks, and you're talking about 480,000 gallons of fuel per day just to keep the convoys running. That didn't include the fuel they were delivering to the front. The solution was brutal efficiency. Fuel depots were set up along the route. Drivers refueled on the move, pulling into a depot, filling up in minutes, and rolling out. No breaks, no delays. The depots operated 24 hours a day, staffed by soldiers who worked in shifts, pumping fuel until their arms went numb. Then there was the maintenance problem. Trucks broke down constantly, engines overheated, tires blew out, transmissions failed. The Red Ball Express had mobile repair units that followed the convoys, fixing trucks on the side of the road. Mechanics worked in the rain, in the dark, with minimal tools. They cannibalized wrecked trucks for parts. They improvised solutions that would make engineers weep. One mechanic, Private Leon Harris, became famous for fixing a broken axle using a fence post and baling wire. It held for 150 miles. Another, Corporal Eddie Washington, kept a truck running with a radiator patched with chewing gum and a prayer. It leaked, but it worked. Then there was the enemy. The Germans knew about the Red Ball Express. They knew the convoys were vital, and they attacked whenever they could. Luftwaffe fighters strafed the roads, machine-gunning trucks, setting fuel tankers ablaze. German artillery shelled known convoy routes. Snipers picked off drivers from the trees. The drivers learned to adapt. They drove at night when possible, using only blackout lights. They spread out when they heard planes. They carried rifles, though most had never fired one in combat. Some convoys had anti-aircraft guns mounted on trucks, manned by soldiers who scanned the skies constantly. And still, they kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the war stopped. The men of the Red Ball Express were fighting two wars, one against the Germans, one against the racism of their own army. They were paid less than white soldiers. They were housed in segregated camps. They were denied access to the same recreation facilities, the same medical care, the same respect. White officers often treated them with contempt, calling them lazy, incompetent, untrustworthy. But the trucks didn't lie. The numbers didn't lie. The Red Ball Express delivered. Day after day, week after week, the convoys rolled, and the front kept moving. Still, the racism persisted. In some towns, French civilians treated black soldiers better than their own officers did. French families invited them to dinner, thanked them, called them heroes. It was a strange, bitter irony, liberating a country that treated them with more dignity than their own. Private Ruckert remembered one incident. His convoy had stopped briefly in a French village. A white officer, a captain, ordered the black drivers to the back of the line for food. The French villagers, seeing this, refused to serve the white soldiers until the black drivers were fed first. The captain was furious. The drivers were stunned, and for a moment they felt something they hadn't felt in a long time: respect. But those moments were rare. Most of the time they just drove, and they endured. Because they had no choice, because the war needed them, because they refused to let racism stop them from doing what they knew was right. By early September, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies to the front. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything an army needed to keep fighting. And it worked. Patton's Third Army continued its advance. By September 1st, they had reached the Meuse River. By mid-September, they were at the German border. Patton himself, a man not known for praising support troops, acknowledged the Red Ball Express. "My men can eat their belts," he said, "but my tanks have got to have gas." The Red Ball Express gave him that gas, and more. They gave him the ammunition to keep firing, the food to keep his soldiers fed, the medical supplies to keep them alive, Without the Red Ball Express, Patton's advance would have stalled. The war would have dragged on. More lives would have been lost. But the Red Ball Express didn't just keep Patton rolling. It changed the way the Army thought about logistics. Before the Red Ball Express, supply lines were rigid, planned months in advance. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics could be flexible, improvised, adapted on the fly. It proved that with enough determination, enough grit, enough refusal to quit, you could move mountains, or at least 400,000 tons of supplies. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially ended. The port of Antwerp in Belgium had finally been cleared and opened. Supplies could now be shipped directly to the front, bypassing the long overland route from Normandy. The convoys were no longer needed. For 83 days, the Red Ball Express had operated. In that time, it had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. It had driven over 100 million miles. It had kept an entire army moving when every logistical calculation said it was impossible. And then, just like that, it was over. The trucks were reassigned. The drivers were sent to other units. The Red Ball signs were taken down. The operation that had been the lifeline of the Allied advance simply disappeared. There were no parades, no medals, no front-page headlines. The men who had driven 20 hours a day, who had risked their lives on bombed-out roads, who had kept the war moving, were sent back to their segregated units and forgotten. But they didn't forget. They knew what they had done. They knew that without them, the war would have been different. Longer, bloodier, maybe even lost. And they carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. For decades, the story of the Red Ball Express was largely forgotten. History books focused on the battles, the generals, the grand strategies. The men who drove the trucks, who kept the supplies moving, were footnotes at best. But in recent years, that has begun to change. Historians have started to recognize the vital role the Red Ball Express played. Museums have created exhibits, documentaries have been made. The men who served, the few who are still alive, have finally begun to receive the recognition they deserve. Private Ruckert lived to be 94. Before he died, he was interviewed for a documentary. He was asked what he wanted people to know about the Red Ball Express. "We weren't heroes," he said. "We were just drivers. But we did our job, and we did it well, and I'm proud of that." Corporal McIntyre passed away in 2003. At his funeral, his son read a letter his father had written but never sent. In it, he described the Red Ball Express, the exhaustion, the danger, the racism, but also the pride, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that what they were doing mattered. "We drove," he wrote, "because someone had to, and we were the ones who could." Sergeant Thomas lived to be 87. He returned to teaching after the war, never speaking much about his service. But in his classroom, he kept a small red ball painted on a piece of wood. When students asked about it, he would smile and say, "That's a reminder that sometimes the most important work is the work no one sees." The Red Ball Express is a story about logistics, but it's also a story about something deeper, about men who were told they weren't good enough, who were relegated to the shadows, who were denied the respect they deserved, and who, when the moment came, proved that they were essential. They didn't fire the guns, they didn't storm the beaches, they didn't capture the cities, but they kept the army moving. They kept the war alive. They did the work that no one else could do or would do, and they did it with a determination, a grit, a refusal to quit that defined heroism in its purest form. In a war filled with grand gestures and dramatic moments, the Red Ball Express was something quieter. It was men driving trucks, men fixing engines, men staying awake when their bodies screamed for sleep, men doing their job day after day, mile after mile, because the war needed them. And in the end, that's what heroism often looks like. Not a charge up a hill, not a dramatic last stand, but the quiet, relentless determination to keep going when everything says you should stop. The Red Ball Express kept Patton rolling, but more than that, it proved something the Army didn't want to admit, that black soldiers were just as capable, just as brave, just as essential as anyone else. That racism was a lie, and that when you gave men a chance, when you trusted them with something important, they would rise to the occasion. The men of the Red Ball Express didn't just deliver supplies, they delivered a message, that they mattered, that they could do the impossible, that they were heroes, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Let's talk about the numbers, because the numbers tell a story all their own. Over 83 days, the Red Ball Express operated with approximately 6,000 trucks at its peak. These trucks made round trips of roughly 400 miles, sometimes more. That's 800 miles per round trip. If each truck made one round trip every 2 days, that's 3,000 round trips per day. Multiply that by 800 miles, and you get 2.4 million miles driven per day. Over 83 days, that's nearly 200 million miles. The convoys delivered an average of 12,500 tons of supplies per day. Over 83 days, that's over 1 million tons. To put that in perspective, that's enough fuel to fill 250 million gallons, enough ammunition to fire 500 million rounds, enough food to feed an army of 500,000 men for 6 months, and all of it was hauled by truck, over roads that barely existed, through weather that ranged from scorching heat to freezing rain, under constant threat of enemy attack, by men who were driving 20 hours a day, sleeping in their trucks, eating on the move. It was a logistical miracle. And it was accomplished by men who were told they weren't capable of it. In the years after the war, some of the men who served in the Red Ball Express were interviewed. Their words paint a picture of what it was like. "We drove until we couldn't see straight," said Private Leroy Johnson. "Your eyes would blur, your hands would cramp, you'd start seeing things that weren't there, but you kept going, because the guy in front of you was going, and the guy behind you was going, and you weren't going to be the one who quit." "The worst part wasn't the driving," said Corporal Samuel Green. "It was the racism. You'd deliver supplies to a unit and they'd treat you like dirt, like you were nothing, and then you'd get back in your truck and drive another 400 miles to do it again, because you knew it mattered, even if they didn't." "I remember one night," said Sergeant David Brown, "we were driving in the rain, couldn't see more than 10 feet in front of us. The road was mud. Trucks were sliding off into ditches, and I thought, this is it. We're not going to make it. But we did. We always did, because we had to." "People ask me if I'm proud of what we did," said Private Henry Washington, "and I tell them, hell yes, I'm proud. We did something no one thought we could do. We kept an army moving. We helped win a war, and we did it with our hands on a steering wheel and our foot on the gas. That's something." For decades, the story of the Red Ball Express was largely ignored. Why? The answer is uncomfortable but necessary. Racism. Plain and simple. The men who served in the Red Ball Express were black. And in the years after the war, America was still deeply segregated. Black veterans returned home to a country that denied them the GI Bill benefits, that refused them housing loans, that barred them from jobs. Their contributions were minimized, dismissed, forgotten. The military itself was slow to acknowledge the Red Ball Express. Official histories focused on combat units, on generals, on battles. Support units, especially black support units, were footnotes. The assumption, rooted in the same racism that had segregated the army in the first place, was that their work wasn't as important. The driving trucks wasn't as heroic as firing guns. But that assumption was wrong. And slowly, painfully, history has begun to correct it. Museums have created exhibits on the Red Ball Express. Documentaries have been made. Books have been written. The men who served, the few who are still alive, have been honored. But it took too long. Too many of them died without ever receiving the recognition they deserved. Too many. Of them lived their entire lives knowing that what they did mattered, but never hearing anyone else say it. That's the tragedy of the Red Ball Express. Not that it happened, but that it was forgotten. The Red Ball Express wasn't the only supply operation of World War II, but it was unique in its scale, its speed, and its improvisation. The Soviet Union had its own supply lines, moving supplies along the Trans-Siberian Railway and through the brutal terrain of the Eastern Front. But those lines were planned, built over years, supported by infrastructure. The British had supply lines running from Egypt to the front lines in North Africa. But those lines moved slowly, methodically, with careful planning and coordination. The Red Ball Express was different. It was born from desperation. It was improvised on the fly. It operated with minimal infrastructure, minimal planning, minimal support. And it worked. Not because it was well designed, but because the men driving the trucks refused to let it fail. That's what made the Red Ball Express a miracle. Not that it was perfect, but that it succeeded despite everything working against it. The backbone of the Red Ball Express was the GMC CCKW, better known as the Deuce and a Half. It was a 2.5-ton cargo truck, rugged, reliable, and capable of carrying twice its rated load if you didn't mind bending the rules. The Deuce and a Half had a 6-cylinder engine that produced 104 horsepower. Not much by today's standards, but enough to haul a fully loaded truck over rough terrain. It had a 4-speed transmission and a 2-speed transfer case, giving it the low-end torque needed for steep hills and muddy roads. It had a top speed of about 45 miles per hour, though most drivers never got close to that on the bombed-out roads of France. The truck was simple, which was its greatest strength. No power steering, no power brakes, no fancy electronics, just an engine, a transmission, and a chassis. If something broke, you could fix it with basic tools. If you didn't have the right part, you could improvise. The drivers loved them and hated them in equal measure, loved them because they were reliable, hated them because they were uncomfortable, loud, and bone-jarring to drive for 20 hours straight. But the Deuce and a Half did its job. And in the end, that's all that mattered. The Red Ball Express route changed as the front moved. But the main artery ran from the beaches of Normandy through the towns of Alençon, Chartres, and Dreux to the front lines near the German border. The roads were marked with red balls painted on signs. No civilian traffic. No other military vehicles unless authorized. The Red Ball Express had absolute priority. But the roads themselves were a nightmare. French highways, built for civilian traffic, were never designed for military convoys. They were narrow, winding, poorly maintained. Bridges were often damaged or destroyed. Detours were common. The drivers learned the routes by heart. They knew every turn, every hill, every dangerous stretch. They knew where the roads were good and where they were terrible. They knew where the Germans liked to attack and where it was relatively safe. And they shared that knowledge. Convoy leaders passed information back and forth. "Watch out for the bridge at kilometer 47. It's shaky. The road near Chartres is washed out. Take the detour." German fighters hit the convoy yesterday near Dreux. Keep your eyes on the sky. It was a collective effort. No one driver could do it alone, but together they made it work. Driving the Red Ball Express was dangerous, not just because of the roads, though those were bad enough, but because of the enemy. The Germans knew about the Red Ball Express. They knew the convoys were vital, and they attacked whenever they could. Luftwaffe fighters strafed the roads, machine-gunning trucks, setting fuel tankers ablaze. The attacks came without warning. One moment you were driving. The next, bullets were ripping through the canvas cover, punching holes in the hood, shattering the windshield. Drivers learned to listen for the sound of aircraft engines. When they heard it, they scattered, pulling off the road, diving into ditches. Some convoys had anti-aircraft guns mounted on trucks, but they were rare. Most drivers just had to hope the planes missed. German artillery was another threat. They shelled known convoy routes, especially at night. The shells came screaming out of the darkness, exploding in the road, flipping trucks, killing drivers. There was no warning. No time to react. Just the sudden, violent end. And then there were the snipers. German soldiers hiding in the trees, picking off drivers one by one. A single shot, and the truck would veer off the road, crash, burn. The convoys couldn't stop to hunt for snipers. They just kept moving, hoping they weren't next. Over the 83 days of the Red Ball Express, hundreds of trucks were destroyed. Dozens of drivers were killed. Hundreds more were wounded. But the convoys kept rolling, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant the war stopped. The physical toll of driving the Red Ball Express was immense. Drivers worked 20-hour shifts, sometimes longer. They slept in their trucks, if they slept at all. They ate on the move, usually cold rations. They didn't shower for days, sometimes weeks. They wore the same clothes until they fell apart. The exhaustion was crushing. Your eyes burned. Your back ached. Your hands cramped from gripping the wheel. Your legs went numb from pressing the pedals. You hallucinated, seeing things that weren't there. Phantom trucks, imaginary obstacles, voices calling your name. Some drivers fell asleep at the wheel and crashed. Others had breakdowns, mental and physical. They couldn't go on. They were pulled from the convoys, replaced by fresh drivers. But there were never enough fresh drivers, so the ones who could keep going did. Private Ruckert described it like this. You reach a point where you're not really awake, but you're not really asleep either. You're just existing. Your body is moving, but your mind is somewhere else. And you just keep driving, because that's all you know how to do. The human cost of the Red Ball Express wasn't just the drivers who were killed or wounded. It was the thousands of men who pushed themselves beyond their limits, who sacrificed their health, their sanity, their lives, to keep the convoys moving. And they did it without complaint, because they knew it mattered. After the war, the men of the Red Ball Express returned home. Most of them went back to the lives they had left behind. They got jobs, raised families, tried to forget the war. But they never forgot the Red Ball Express. They never forgot what they had done. And they never forgot that no one seemed to care. There were no parades for the Red Ball Express, no medals, no official recognition. The army moved on, the country moved on, And the men who had driven 20 hours a day, who had kept an army moving, who had helped win a war, were forgotten. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that historians began to take notice. Books were written, documentaries were made, exhibits were created. The story of the Red Ball Express slowly began to emerge from the shadows. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the Red Ball Express, a ceremony was held in France. French officials honored the men who had served, calling them heroes. A monument was erected along the old Red Ball route, a simple stone marker with a red ball painted on it. Some of the surviving drivers attended. They were old men now, in their 80s and 90s. They stood in the rain, listening to speeches in French and English, watching as the monument was unveiled. And for the first time in 60 years, they heard someone say, "Thank you." It was too little, too late. But it was something. One of the most painful ironies of the Red Ball Express is this. The men who drove the trucks were liberating a continent from tyranny while living under tyranny themselves. They were fighting a war against fascism, against racism, against the idea that some people were superior to others. And yet they served in a segregated army. They were denied the same rights, the same respect, the same opportunities as their white counterparts. They liberated French towns and were greeted as heroes by French civilians. But when they returned to their own country, they were denied service at restaurants, barred from hotels, forced to sit in the back of buses. They helped defeat Nazi Germany, a regime built on racial hatred. And then they came home to a country where racial hatred was enshrined in law. The irony was not lost on them. Private Ruckert said it best. "We were fighting for freedom, but we weren't free, and that's something you never forget." But they didn't let that stop them. They drove the trucks, they delivered the supplies, they did their job, because they believed, despite everything, that it mattered, that the war was worth fighting. That freedom, even if they didn't have it yet, was worth fighting for. And in doing so, they proved something, that the ideals America claimed to stand for, freedom, equality, justice, were worth fighting for, even if America itself had not lived up to those ideals yet. After the Red Ball Express ended in November 1944, the trucks were reassigned. Some went to other supply operations. Some were sent to the Pacific Theater. Some were simply parked and forgotten. The drivers were reassigned, too. Some went to other quartermaster units. Some were sent to combat units, now that the Army was desperate for manpower. Some were sent home, their service complete. But the impact of the Red Ball Express didn't end. The lessons learned about logistics, about improvisation, about the importance of supply lines were incorporated into military doctrine. The Red Ball Express proved that logistics could be flexible, that supply lines could be adapted on the fly, that with enough determination you could move mountains. Those lessons were used in Korea, in Vietnam, in every conflict since. The Red Ball Express changed the way the military thought about logistics, and that change saved lives. But the men who drove the trucks, who made it all possible, were largely forgotten. Until recently. Today, there are memorials to the Red Ball Express. In France, along the old route, there are markers and monuments. In the United States, there are exhibits in museums, plaques in veterans' halls. But the best memorial is the story itself. The story of men who were told they weren't good enough, who were denied the respect they deserved, who were relegated to the shadows, and who, when the moment came, proved that they were essential. The story of men who drove 20 hours a day, who kept an army moving, who helped win a war. Not because they wanted glory, but because it was their job. And they did it better than anyone else could have. The story of the Red Ball Express is a story about logistics, but it's also a story about heroism, about determination, about refusing to quit when everything says you should. It's a story that deserves to be remembered, not just because of what they did, but because of who they were. Men who proved that heroism doesn't always wear a combat badge. Sometimes it wears grease-stained gloves and drives through the night. We owe the men of the Red Ball Express more than just recognition. We owe them the truth that they were essential, that without them, the war would have been different, longer, bloodier, maybe even lost. We owe them the acknowledgement that they were heroes, not in spite of the racism they faced, but because they overcame it, because they did their job, did it well, did it with pride, even when no one was watching, even when no one cared. We owe them the promise that their story will not be forgotten, that future generations will know what they did, that the Red Ball Express will be remembered not as a footnote, but as a vital part of the story of World War II. And we owe them the commitment to do better, to build a country where no one is told they aren't good enough because of the color of their skin, where everyone has the chance to prove themselves, where heroism is recognized, no matter who performs it. The men of the Red Ball Express drove 6,000 trucks a day. They delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. They kept an army moving. They helped win a war. But more than that, they proved something. That when you give people a chance, when you trust them with something important, they will rise to the occasion. That heroism comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most important work is the work no one sees. That's the legacy of the Red Ball Express. And that's a legacy worth remembering.